Welcome to the October 9th bhyve production user call. We have Patrick, Hans, Jan, Hizam, John, and myself, Michael, so far. And I'm pleased to report that the Eurobhyvecon videos are up. There are a dozen videos, and I've broken them into the major topics, plus an hour-long open discussion that I didn't want to get too fine-grained on at the very end. But Hizam, your Silva topic has been very popular, and along with your CPU ID work, Hans. So thank you for joining. And Alexei gave a heck of a talk about GPU pass-through with his discoveries and all. And I'm pleased to report that was his very first presentation, let alone at an international conference. To whom it may concern, we had a great discussion yesterday about improving the OpenZFS test suite and what notions of stable releases look like and who would consume them, be it backup providers versus hyperconverged providers who are trying to get on the Magic Quadrant. So the recording is not out there. I did not record it. I was sick as a dog, but the discussion is in the document under October 8th. Hey, Sam, any thoughts on bhyvecon, and do you have any news to report on Silva? If you're available.
It was great. It was great. A lot of new users, a lot of new testers. It's fun. We have been hacking away at fixing a lot of bugs actually over the last few days and making things polished enough for a port release so we can get a beta up soon enough.
Do
And
you
yeah,
have a porter?
uh,
Was Dave willing to help or someone?
yeah, Dave was willing to help. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Anything from us broadly as a group? Are you
No,
engaged
nothing
in?
yet. Nothing yet. Once
Fantastic.
the port is up, there'll be a lot of stuff to do, but is that
Okay. Well,
yeah.
to whom it may concern, check out the video. It was a great demo, and I thank you for participating. I know it's hard to
Yeah, no
kind of
worries.
run blind, not seeing the audience and all that, but I think it went great. Okay, speaking of discussions at EuroBhyveCon, Hans, thank you for giving an overview of your CPU ID work. That began with pulling in a few things from Patrick's work at Oxide, and I'm so glad we have the two of you. So, Hans, let's discuss what steps are ahead of us. And I know, just to whom it may concern, we have a proposal into the FreeBSD Foundation, who's been sort of passing it along further, but hopefully within a reasonable amount of time that will get funded, and we can, I don't know, go through the steps that you outlined. Would you like to recap those steps?
Um, okay. So to get the CPU ID work going as well right now, the first step was support Patrick's work on CPU ID to FreeBSD, which was relatively simple. And then I implemented a interface to user space, which which illumos doesn't have because Oxide apparently didn't need that, and which works on FreeBSD and illumos alike, and which just does the bare minimum. You can configure it, but all the hard work is left on yourself, and you have a boatload of options that you have to pass. And well, it's not really usable, but it illustrates that the CPU ID works. And the proposal is about mostly making it usable for, well, yeah, for anyone really who doesn't want to type a gazillion of options and want to mess with the individual bits of all of the CPU ID information. So that's what was my short talk about. A couple of ideas that I had how the user interface should look like and what kind of features it should provide to make this as easy to use as possible. Yes, and right now I'm waiting for the proposal to be funded, and then I will continue this work.
And broadly, how does that relate for our readers and listeners to live migration?
Well, as far as I understand, and as I've pointed out in the talk, is that for live migration, you want to have a certain level of control about the CPU ID information that is exposed to a guest, because there may be differences in the VM hosts that you want to run it on. For instance, one VM host could lack a feature or could require a security mitigation. And in case of that, you want to find the lowest common denominator and use that everywhere. Other issues could be that you're changing from one brand of CPU to another. Well, one brand string of CPU to another, like from Xeon to something other um, that's just different. That just reports a different name. That is an issue in live migration, of course. And of course, it's also an issue if you want to do offline migration. Even then, this can cause trouble with your software licenses, if you're having any that check this kind of stuff. So the basic idea is that in order to support live migration, you're just using a subset of the architecture, which could be based on a real CPU, or you could just base it on a abstract architecture level that once was defined for x86, and use that everywhere. And you probably don't need to worry much about this. But of course, this is only one small part of going towards live migration.
Sure. Have you looked at the UPB code that attempted to do that? And I believe it was John's work to save off, be it register to a common format. And there was some argument about what the format should look like.
You mean for actual live migration?
Yes.
No, I haven't looked
I
at
think
that
it was
yet.
save. Okay.
So if
So,
I want to implement live migration for bhyve, my first step would be to take everything Oxide's done in that regard and make that work.
sure.
And step by step, and add the missing user space bits and add the missing kernel bits where they need to differ between illumos and FreeBSD. And well, then fill in whatever's missing. And thinking about the format of data that I'm using for live migration, or the means of communication between two, well, VM hosts or bhyve processors really, is something that I would think about probably pretty late in a project, because um, before I can put something out in a data format for communication, I need to have the infrastructure in a bhyve project so that it actually can get the data first before I think about format. Or at least that's what I think it would be.
So to date, you've obviously bumped into differences between what Patrick's done on illumos and what's either progressed or stagnated on FreeBSD and kept it out of alignment. Uh, where do you see the commonality moving forward, and where do you see the OS specific bits? And is how trivial or non-trivial is that untangling?
Um, I would just say it's non-trivial because
Yeah.
just because of the sheer mass of things that have changed on both sides.
Mhm.
And a lot of the changes on the Illuma side will probably not apply as they are to previously, like the CPU ID control stuff that was pretty much OS agnostic. But there's other things that are in there that I haven't even really looked at that work on the lower level VM states, as far as I understand. And that may very well be OS specific. So that will be a certain bit more work. The biggest challenge I see with porting the Illumos things to FreeBSD is that most of that, or a lot of that, was written years ago. And as bhyve has evolved on both ends, usually you want not just port the individual commits, but put them together with later changes that are related or fix bugs in them. That's the one side that needs to be figured out which belongs to which. And the other big problem that I see there is that each of these changes or sets of changes um, must be adapted to FreeBSD's bhyve of today without breaking anything, without regressing anything, without changing the user interface in incompatible ways. So there's a lot of testing will be involved, which is one of the reasons why I would like to have the bhyve test suite that illumos has on FreeBSD. Apart from the fact that it's useful in general, I guess. So the non-trivial part, in my opinion, really comes from the sheer amount of work that's involved with that. And of course, there's also a massive amount of code review that needs to be done. And yeah, so it's just a lot of work, not necessarily very hard work, but a lot, and not all of it will be pleasant.
Right. Well, hopefully this can be structured as a one-time massive operation followed by smooth sailing on both sides moving forward. So I suppose uh,
We have done something.
do we have criteria for what that looks like to make it easier moving forward in the long term? Go
We
ahead.
have done something like this in illumos, actually in Smarter, as Patrick and me, when we updated our old bhyve that we had to the latest version of FreeBSD had at the time, which was in late 2017. That was a bit easier because we didn't need to worry about breaking anything or breaking compatibility. The only demand was that afterwards it just had to work. But basically, it was a massive amount of work back then, and it will be a massive amount this time if we do this. And I think this is only really useful if we stay on that path and continue to port changes in both directions. I know that illumos takes changes from FreeBSD on a regular basis, although they skip some parts and mostly kernel parts really and recently because the kernel sites have diverged quite a bit. And I'm not sure anyone on the FreeBSD side has looked at the illumos improvements in a while.
I'm
So
guessing they haven't. And can you characterize what areas those are in?
well, that's a bit difficult because I
Okay.
mean illumos changing all over the place.
Yeah, I see.
Fix their improved stuff, implemented new features, like all the things that Oxide did that I don't even fully understand yet what they have. I understand they adapted it quite a lot to suit their needs. A lot of that I think could be useful on stock illumos and on FreeBSD too.
Well, Patrick, can you characterize some of the great things you've done at Oxide and Illumos with regarding to bhyve?
Sure. I mean, most of the focus there has been making bhyve on Illumos ready for production and ready for being able to live migrate guests around. So that has been kind of the North Star for all of those efforts. I know that kind of the intent of me being here today was to discuss kind of what it might look like to bring FreeBSD and Illumos closer together. On that side, as Hans mentioned, Andy and some of the other folks do pretty regularly try and keep the bhyve user space synced up from FreeBSD into Illumos. But on the kernel side, there has been a pretty significant divergence there. I kind of, in my mind, I essentially forked when the UPB stuff was going in on the FreeBSD side. I disagreed with some of the technical decisions there on what they were doing for save restore live migrate. It kind of didn't meet the rigor that I wanted to see in that space. So we decided to do that somewhat differently and kind of more importantly applied, I feel a higher level of rigor to that. And we do have working live migration, not using the C-based user space that kind of ships with normal bhyve, but with the Rust-based one that we've written um, to use illumos bhyve. Um, there is a pretty significant divergence at this point. Kind of one of the significant pieces was the way that bhyve does instruction emulation for instructions that are accessing emulated devices and the like. In order to support a second user space, one that isn't the C-based user space, we pretty significantly overhauled uh, how instruction emulation exits are handled by user space. In the existing FreeBSD code, there is kind of a piece of shared instruction emulation code that is compiled both for user space and for the kernel, and it passes a struct between kernel space and user space and uses that same compiled code in both places. That obviously does not work at all if you're going to try and use some other user space. So we kind of really pretty significantly changed how that works. So kernel space does essentially all of the instruction decoding, and then if it needs to, for example, access memory mapped I/O or port I/O, it communicates that to user space via specific exits that say, I need you, user space, to fulfill this memory mapped I/O or this port I/O request, and user space performs it and then loads the result back into the kernel to finish the emulation there. That is kind of one of the big changes. And then kind of on the other side, a bunch of the in-kernel device emulation was for the purposes of hardening and for the purposes of kind of simplifying things as much as possible to make live migration easy and supportable in the long term. Kind of went around the countryside fixing up and simplifying the device emulation in the kernel. So as far as kind of where I see these things could be brought to being more similar, if that was an interest on the FreeBSD side, I think that a bunch of the in-kernel device emulation changes that we've made could be ported over to FreeBSD if they wanted that, if they wanted to kind of leverage the work that we've done to make things like live migration easier. That's something that could be done. I really, I gathered from kind of the discussion and notes from bhyvecon at EuroBSDCon, it seemed to me like there was kind of discussion or interest in a model similar to OpenZFS, where the entire code base is shared for the kernel VMM portion. I don't think that's feasible at all. There's just kind of too much difference between the two operating systems when it comes to things like synchronization primitives, what operating system facilities are being used essentially to fulfill certain parts of the VMM. Like it's been a while since I looked at the FreeBSD code, but when I did that port back in 2017 or whatever, a big piece of it was on the FreeBSD side that we're using the VM system to generate the nested page tables. And on illumos, we simply couldn't do that. So I built and then rebuilt the system that creates and manages those nested page tables. So that there are places where there just isn't easy alignment. So I don't think it's really feasible to try and chase a code base that can be shared across both platforms. I think one or the other would suffer if someone attempted to do that. So that's kind of why I wanted to come here and chime in, is there are definitely places where pieces could be ported over in one direction or the other, but I think if someone felt like doing a big sync up, I don't think that would be particularly productive. We just couldn't do something like that, like as was done when the initial port work was done back in 2017. It would undo a lot of the work that has been done on the illumos side, and at least speaking for Oxide, it would break a lot of the interfaces that we now consume. So that's kind of the gist of it. I don't know if there are questions or comments from Hans or from other folks on that
Well, I have
topic.
one comment from a production user, which is simply, regardless of the internals, can we achieve migration between FreeBSD and illumos of migration of VMs such that it's publicly facing common enough, again, regardless of the internals?
Uh, Potentially, you would. So the interface that the kernel VMM presents to user space on illumos is considered private. So we reserve the right to at any time uh, break that interface. We've generally tried to avoid making such changes. We have versioned the interface, so there's a version number you can query from the kernel VMM when you're interacting with it, so that user space can at least have expectations about the interface that it is using. But it does not have the same sort of guarantees that FreeBSD makes in terms of versioning that ioctl interface. And similarly, we do not. There's what is it? libvmm API exists on the user space side to sort of sit on top of that ioctl interface, but the Rust-based user space that we built doesn't use that. It uses the ioctls directly. So that in terms of migration between the two, you would need to probably at the very minimum sync up the in-kernel emulated devices so that the device model between the two platforms is the same. And you would need a hypervisor user space that ran in both places. We've built our Rust one against what exists in illumos. At the very least, you would need to change the instruction emulation code to operate like how the illumos one does for that to have any hope of working in both places. And speaking frankly, it is not a huge Oxide priority for our Rust-based hypervisor user space to run on FreeBSD. If someone was floating patches for that, like if they want to run their own fork and have it work on FreeBSD, that's great. But I don't think Oxide is going to take PRs to add FreeBSD support to Propolis. It would complicate that piece of software in ways that we don't need. So
Sure.
it's open source, and folks are more than encouraged to do with that software what they want. But in terms of Oxide's effort, our focus has been on a stable and high performing VMM for the things that we need. So that's the gist of it.
And I appreciate that. Jan, you have a few questions. Do you want to punch those in as appropriate?
My question is, did you implement legacy I/O port emulation to allow drivers like the Windows drivers from NVIDIA to work?
We are not doing any PCI pass-through of NVIDIA devices or any devices for that matter. It's all emulated devices. So there are I/O port emulated devices. I think our VirtIO uses that, but we're not doing anything in terms of PCI pass-through.
And that's across the board, no PCI pass-through?
Not in Propolis for the things we're doing.
Okay.
It's not compatible with migrating the state unless you have the ability to migrate the virtual function state to a
Right.
different host physical function, which would be a real trick to pull off. But
Any other questions?
Would you be willing to send some Oxide computer stickers to the server operations department at Google in Fort Wayne, Indiana?
That's a very specific question.
I am not in charge of the sticker distribution, nor am I work remotely, so I'm not in the office with the pile of swag, but I can ask around.
That would mean the world to my team. We actually talk about Oxide all the time. We don't have them, but we talk about that.
What features stand out for you at the company you may or may not be able to mention that you just mentioned?
We think it's like the future. Like, so, we famously, long before my time, pioneered taking like servers in a completely different direction. And then we feel like the rest of the industry caught up with like Open Compute Project and all this totally badass stuff. And then right when we do that, Oxide takes it further. So we have like a cultural thing, like my other computer is made of razor blades and hate. Like some guys get that tattooed on them who have been in the department for a long time, and like it's like a thing. And this is the antidote to that.
Well, Patrick, you're not in the marketing department, but feel free to find out more about that whole attitude at a certain large cloud provider that starts with a G. Those are very kind words. Thank you, Alexander. And you've been great with quotations this last few calls. Patrick, have things stabilized in your development, or do you have a big giant slew of new changes coming that will, even if there was progress, small or big, it would negate it in a heartbeat? You're here to reveal your product roadmap, but tell me what you can.
No, I mean in terms of the hypervisor, things have been pretty stable for a while, I'd say.
Cool. Hans, any questions for Patrick?
Right now, I don't really. I a bit overwhelmed.
Understandably.
One of the things that I'd like to point out is that what I had in mind is not to have a portable VMM code base similar to OpenCFS. Of course, there would be differences. And primarily my focus was on bringing changes from illumos to FreeBSD and not the other way around. In particular, because I think right now that's where the good stuff is at. And of course, there are things in FreeBSD which I would totally love to have in illumos, but those aren't really, well, first of all, I don't think, or you said they aren't relevant for Oxide, like a GPU pass-through, which is something that I would really like to have. On the other hand, I think not much of that is actually in the kernel side, really. So maybe that's not something we need to worry about much. Anyway, thank you very much for your summary of what you've done and what you think the challenges will be if we want to put these things back together. Yeah.
I will interject. The public record will show that the UPB folks have been completely silent, and if their code is not the best strategy, coming out of university, then if it is to be replaced with something better, so be it.
Well, I don't know if it's arrogance or ignorance on my part, but if I were to do live migration for bhyve, for the classics bhyve user space written in C, I would look at the Oxide stuff and see if I can fill in the missing bits in user space. And that's something that I could probably try to attempt on bhyve on illumos without the need to port any of that fancy new stuff to Oxide, to FreeBSD, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And well, if we were going to do this on FreeBSD, I would still look at the stuff that Oxide did.
Yeah, of
try
course.
to imitate, because I'm convinced that it is great, even if I haven't really understood all of it yet, or even looked at it, all of it
I
yet.
trust Patrick will answer questions as they come up. Patrick's been awesome to date.
I certainly hope so.
So, well, this is a bunch to digest, but it's very accurate and plausible. And I have no desire to wait for institutions to possibly come up with something and then disappear again. So I think the comparative feature analysis and code analysis is valid because there are still opportunities, big and small, for both to benefit. Um,
One of the things that I found very interesting, Patrick, what you said is that about the page table walker for the guest page tables. If I understood it correctly, that illumos pretty much implemented that completely on their own because the FreeBSD code wasn't portable because it was using parts of the FreeBSD VM system. Did I understand this correctly?
Yes, yeah, we have our own implementation that does the page table stuff for the nested page tables.
Was a detail that I had completely forgotten about. But on the other hand, I think this is something that could actually be ported to FreeBSD, that it is no longer dealing with the VM system, with the native VM system to do this. The other thing is when we did pass-through on SmartOS, we actually ported the illumos, no, not illumos, the FreeBSD IOMMU driver that was integrated in bhyve. So it had its own little IOMMU implementation for Intel that we ported because that was much easier than trying to get our IOMMU drivers to working on illumos. So that was a similar situation where FreeBSD had something done completely independent of the way it could be done. Using your native drivers, which I believe even FreeBSD had already at the time, was something which turned out to be very useful to just port it to Illumos and ignore our special IOMMU stuff. So yeah, that's what I thought about them.
Yeah, I'm on the topic of the nested page table stuff. I'm not certain that's something that FreeBSD would want to take from us. I know on the Illumos side, one of our constraints was that we mandate that all guest memory be be in memory. We don't permit that to be swapped out or anything, so that is kind of baked into our. I think the analog on the FreeBSD side would be that all of the guest memory is considered wired. I don't know if switching to the page table implementation that we have in Illumos, if switching FreeBSD to that would then impose constraints around how people are expecting guest memory to work. So I'm not certain that'd be something they want. It certainly on the Illumos side, and particularly on the Oxide side, the expectation that all guest memory be actually in memory kind of simplifies a bunch of things, but there are folks out there who might want guest memory to be swappable for performance reasons. We don't want to do that ever, but that would certainly complicate it. On the IOMMU front, I know we've had some discussions about it, and while PCI pass-through hasn't been a priority for us, I think, at least in talking with other folks on the Illumos side, I think we would want. I know on the AMD side we didn't do that port, but that that folks were kind of hoping that if and when that is a priority, that we not, rather than again porting over what FreeBSD has in terms of kind of a PCI pass-through specific IOMMU code, that we actually buckle down and actually, write a proper driver for the AMD IOMMU stuff, given that it can be useful for more than just PCI pass-through, right? Like for other things in the system. So,
Patrick, a quick thing. Are you familiar with the recent foundation work from Kib to clean up the AMD IOMMU, which
no.
was definitely a shim and definitely broken?
I
Got a bunch of attention.
I have not been following any foundation work.
Okay, it's in FreeBSD. That's it, indeed one you may want to look at for the long term because it was a big step forward. Because the original NetApp folks pretty much had a shim, and it was burning users, and it got attention. So I'll try to find the review for that for your enlightenment.
Sure. I know that our port of the Intel IO Memu stuff, while it works, is not fantastic. This was another one of those where kind of the interface differences between FreeBSD and illumos meant that we had to do some goofy things to get that driver to work with little modification. So I think a similar effort for porting another driver. I would hope that someone would just they may use the FreeBSD work as a guide, but kind of copying it over and building shim code to make it work with little modification leads to kind of some really ugly shims to make that work with those differing interface expectations between the two operating systems.
Okay. John, how's your audio? If you're listening in.
Oh, no, listening. I use my speaker on my computer because it is much easier to hear. But when I need to talk, I shift over to my headset so the microphone doesn't cause problems. So it takes me a minute to respond to you.
Sure. So you've been a pretty heavy user of PCI pass-through, but I take that to be in direct conflict with any notion of live migration. But do you have some notions and desires for live migration in the long term?
There are areas where live migration would be beneficial, but in those arenas we tend to use a QEMU OpenStack type solution.
Mm-hmm.
I have many systems where they're running pass-through for NVMe devices. I have areas where we pass through entire network cards or we pass through the VFs. And those are systems where, for instance, we may be running a Kates cluster. And if you're familiar with Kates and most of your application programming on top of it, if you lose a container, a pod, or what have you, your application is not supposed to go down. So, we can drop an entire VM and we don't lose anything. It just shifts to another system and another pod gets started up when that VM comes back. Typically after we do hypervisor work, then it'll rebalance and go on its way. So it's a different model, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But yeah, would love to see some work in the area of migration and being able to support this kind of stuff. But I understand it's difficult.
And has your motivation for pass-through been strictly SRIOV mix, or is it also potentially graphics devices for compute or otherwise?
So I had mentioned to you that we've tried passing through some GPUs, and it's been, I hesitate to say iffy. Some things work and some things don't. I don't think I have any GPU pass-through where we're actually using the GPU for graphics. Any pass-through that we do, we're passing an NVIDIA GPU through for AI style work. Usually the VM itself is running some variant of a Linux distribution with the appropriate NVIDIA drivers installed for what's being passed through.
Got it.
And it's pretty stable. I mean, with all that said, I do have some systems where I haven't chased this all down yet, but and actually, I don't know that this is pertinent to this discussion. There are some areas in when we do PPT that if you do a PCI conf on the physical device on the hypervisor, you see what what it supports. You see all the bars, blah blah blah. You see all the capabilities. But when you pass it through, and then you look at the capabilities, there are some things that are missing, and if you're not careful, those can affect performance pretty seriously. And that's one of the things that eventually I'll probably give me another year, and I'll probably have a bit more information to say on that.
Got it. Well, document what you learn. And Patrick, we value your time. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you
Sort of
very much.
state of the art on that. And do note the kind words that you're doing it right. Thank you, Alexander, for that. I'm looking up that AMD upgrade. I will mail that when I find it. Anyway, Patrick, any last thoughts, requests, ideas, stories?
Nope.
Cool. Well, my sincere thanks for joining in. You're welcome to stick around. We'll probably touch on a few more topics, but that was the heart of it, what we wanted to discuss, and the timing is perfect insofar as we're all at our various crossroads, and we're trying to get all things GPU pass-through tightened up, and some notion of live migration work on FreeBSD, and that's where you've sort of given a very good path to learn from and hopefully borrow from. I'll leave it at that. Anyway, thank you, sir. That said, John, you probably want to check out that video from Alexei on GPU pass-through. He went through sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what he sees on all those various reset bugs, given that PCI was never intended for any notion of hot swappability or sharing among various VMs. John, it's been a while. Anything else fun from your desk to share? Be it wild ideas like NFS clients within the VM user space process or otherwise? I know you need a moment to switch between devices to respond. And we've lost Jan. He had some comments on this Tom Jones comment on Proxmox. And let me look at the wiki while you're doing that. John, I hear you.
I've spent most of my time recently has been spent chasing down performance-related problems, networking, various things, and of course, different drivers for different network cards all tend to respond a little bit differently. But it just keeps me busy,
Have
keeps me
you
employed.
found anything definitive and worth sharing with the broader audience?
Not specifically. I've actually been playing around with instead of using the PF interface, I allocate VFs and then use a VF not pass through. And interestingly enough, I can see where that actually performs better than using the PF sometimes. It's an amusing. I wouldn't have thought that, but that's what I'm seeing. And I haven't really dug much deeper than that right now.
You said PF versus VF?
Yeah.
As in not packet filter or packet filter?
No.
So what are you talking about?
Physical. When you take a network card
Yes.
and IO with on IOV control, you generate VFs, and I typically put those VFs in pass-through mode. But if I take one of those and don't pass it through and use that VF on the host instead of the PF, which is the physical function device, interestingly enough, sometimes it seems to perform better. It's to me it was strange when I saw that, and I haven't chased that any farther.
I'll struggle with the terminology here, but you found that it was possibly faster when
When I use the
virtualized or
when
shared,
I use a
split up.
VF for the
Yeah.
host interface instead of the PF.
Interesting.
Like with an
Worth
Intel,
investigating.
right? I don't know if anybody else has run into that or tried it, or it was just interesting to me.
And then again, as a host interface, not a VM interface.
So
Heard you
you
correctly.
you take a network card
Yep.
and you generate, 12 VFs,
Yep.
and you all of them except one you pass through to a VM. And then one of the VFs you don't pass it through and it will show up on the host, and you assign that to be the active interface on the host instead of the PF.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else has played around with this, but it was just interesting. Like I say, it was just interesting when I saw this, and I was, the these high end cards all have, I believe Mellanox calls it an E switch embedded in them, and there's just appears to be some difference into how the packets are traveling.
Interesting. Truly fascinating. It takes quite the mental code path to get you there to consider that in the first place. That's a wonderful what if. So yeah, keep us posted on if you can find something definitive. Is that purely on Mellanox or other versions?
Yeah, actually, this is mostly on Mellanox. I'm getting ready to hopefully try some Chelsea cards.
That would be great.
I have I have a bunch of their T6s. There's a new T7 that they've come out with. I'm hoping to get my fingers on some of those pretty soon.
Wow. Okay. Well, yeah, keep us posted because it's fascinating to split up your NIC as a pool of resources, hand some back to the host, some to the VMs, and I suppose you're doing a lot of heavy lifting on the card itself, and well, that could indeed, bypass kernel operations. That's it.
Right.
Your history.
I don't have to have a bridge on the host. The switch inside the network card basically handles all that traffic.
Well, that's pretty tangible. The NIC is the bridge.
Yes.
Okay, that warrants further science. Please keep it coming. Other topics, questions, ideas. Jan disappeared, and we can talk about this little bridging on Proxmox topic in the future. Here's the wiki page he mentioned, and it was a bit confusing if Tom Jones is saying Proxmox either gets it right. I thought they bridged automatically. He's saying, I'm going to mute you for the hiss. He says it's not doing it right or something, but we can discuss that later. It's Proxmox. It's not a top priority for bhyve. Anyway, but it's definitely one to watch. Keep up the good work, everyone. Hans, I know that's a lot to digest. Hey, Zam, keep the patches and goodies coming. It sounds like we'll have a port of Sylve sooner rather than later. That is exciting. People are loving it. I hope you've untangled the various dependencies such that people don't get scared that you might need Samba for some functionality. However, someone just doing VMs might not want that. I'll let you navigate how best to handle that. And that's an overwhelming plenty for this call. Any other final thoughts and ideas, questions? I can't thank you all enough for bhyvecon. That was just timely and perfect and just inspirational. It was great to drag people out of the audience and have, say, the host of EuroBSDCon give a quick update on NUMA emulation, which is great for development. So that said, Alexander, would you like the honors?
Smash up that like button and hit subscribe immediately if you haven't already.
Beautifully put. Thank you, everyone. Take care.